Hi, this is Philip Pador, founder of NCLEX RN 45-Day Challenge. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Abdominal Aortic Aneurysm, or AAA, or AAA. An abdominal aortic aneurysm, as the name suggests, is an aneurysm, a ballooning that develops in the abdominal sections of your aorta. So you might remember that there are true and false types of aneurysms. But when you hear abdominal aortic aneurysm, or AAA, what's most likely being referred to is a true aneurysm, a permanent dilation of the wall of the aorta. So an aneurysm that you get in your abdominal aorta can look something like this. So this here is a bit of your aorta. Let's say it's this section here. So you can see that what's happened to it, it's just a sort of symmetrically ballooned out of both sides. And we can call it aneurysms that ballooned out of symmetrically on both sides. We call that a fusiform aneurysm. And also notice that all of the layers of the wall of the aorta involved in this ballooning out. So they all sort of dilate out together. So you have the three layers of the aorta involved: the intima, the media, and the adventitia. And they all balloon out together as part of a true aneurysm. And by the way, to be considered an aneurysm, a dilation has to be a permanent, and it has to dilate the vessel out of at least 1.5 times its normal diameter. So this space here would end up being 1.5 times the normal diameter, or at least 1.5 times. So do they happen in a particular place in the abdominal aorta? Well, yeah, they do. The AAAs most commonly occur below the renal arteries that supply the kidneys. And about 95% happen there, and we'll touch on why. That is in a little bit. But first, let me tell you why we really don't want the AAAs to occur in our aorta. So it's really the potential complications of aneurysms that makes them so dangerous. For one, they can rupture, and when they rupture, they start to pour blood out of the aorta and into the tissues in the neighborhood. So that means there's less blood able to go around the body to provide you with oxygen and glucose and other nutrients. So if a ruptured aneurysm isn't taken to the hospital right away, a lot of tissues in your body would start become oxygen deprived and start to get seriously damaged. And rupture is really the biggest worry about abdominal aortic aneurysm. I'll outline a few other complications of aneurysms in a minute, but it's really the rupture and outpouring of the blood into the abdominal cavity that we worry about the most, in which we replace. Okay, so why else don't we like aneurysms? They can develop clots that form inside them. Clots, also called thrombi, in this case can form when blood sort of ducts out of the normal circulations to go hang out in an aneurysm. So this isn't such a huge problem with abdominal aneurysm, because the abdominal aorta seems to develop generally fusiform aneurysms. But you can probably see how something like a berry aneurysm or the saccular aneurysms, which would be an awesome place for the thrombus formation, because blood just sort of gets in there and kick back and relax. So these are bad because if the clot gets big enough, it might occlude the blood vessels completely. So no, blood can get through, and that would be bad. On top of that, beads of thrombus can break off, or embolize and float around in the bloodstreams, and then this would be bad because then this little emboli can get stuck in the smaller vessels and cause ischemic damage, which is damage caused by oxygen deprivation, because they're preventing the flow of blood in that given vessel. So yeah, I said the saccular aneurysms don't usually develop in the abdominal aorta. But we still have to think about potential emboli floating around, because if you have a AAA, you may also have a saccular berry aneurysm somewhere, and clot might be developing there. And the last thing I'll mention about why aneurysms are bad is that aneurysms can compress things. And specifically, they can compress their neighbor structures that lives beside them. So particularly in our example here, you can see how this aneurysm that we have developed here underneath the kidneys. This bulge here might be compressing on the vena cava here. And that means that blood can't return as easily because, remember, these are veins. So blood is going to be draining up this way. So with this sort of bulge of the aorta here, blood can continue to drain through unhindered through the vena cava and into the right atrium of the heart. So they can compress things, and that's a problem with aneurysm. They can also cause a lot of pain. You can imagine if you have this big bulging mass in the middle of your tummy. You might be in a little bit of pain because it's going to compress on the things and trigger your neurons in the sense of pain. So there are some reasons why aneurysms are not our favorite thing in the world. But why do they occur in the first place? How do they develop? Well, there's a couple of reasons. So the most common reason that aorta would balloon out here is because of it's something called atherosclerosis or degenerative change. So that just means that the walls of the aorta start to change from the normal, where they're nice and strong elastic, and they start to get weaker and less elastic. They become more firm and hard and weaker. Less elastic and more firm artery is less able to deal with the blood pressure waves that passes by every second. And there are three main causes an artery would undergo atherosclerosis or hardening. And one is atherosclerosis, which is where you get these fatty deposits on the inner lining of the artery. Calcifications of the wall of the artery where calcium just builds up on the wall of the artery as we age. That can cause the artery to stiffen as well. Chronically elevated blood pressures or chronically high blood pressure that can cause the arteries to undergo arteriosclerosis as well, because the chronically high blood pressure causes thickening of the medial layer. So these three things are major players in the development of atherosclerosis, which then predisposes you to the development of aneurysm. But there's actually a little bit more to it. In the media, remember that the middle layer of the aorta, there's lots and lots of proteins like collagen, in which we give the aorta its tensile strength. So it's the ability to withstand the pressure and elastic that gives the aorta the elastic recoil ability to spring back to normal after a blood pressure wave passes by. And as we descend down to the aorta, and particularly in the abdominal aorta region, we have less collagen and elastin than we do up in the top. Even in perfectly healthy aortas, so the lower parts of the aorta, therefore more prone to developing aneurysms just as it is. We see some degenerations of the collagens and elastins. So not only in the aorta becoming slightly dilated and weaker because some collagens are degenerating, but the aorta also ends up not being able to spring back to its normal shape as it used to be able to. After a blood pressure wave passes by, so remember earlier I said that 95% of AAAs happen below the renal arteries. Well, this is why. There's not much collagen in our last in there compared to higher parts of the aorta. So it's a lot more predisposed. Furthermore, once you've developed that slight bulging of the aorta, in most people, it tends to enlarge over time. And that's because according to the law of Laplace, dilation of the tubes increases tension on its walls by the fluids that's inside. So that it increases tensions on the walls that might cause the balloons to even go further. And so, on its sort of progress, it's like a vicious cycle. So what are the risk factors of developing aneurysms? Number one, atherosclerosis, that deposition of fatty substance along the walls of the aorta. That's a risk factor that will increase your odds of developing an aneurysm. Second is smoking. That's a huge risk factor, particularly because it contributes to atherosclerosis, and partially because it directly damages the walls of your arteries. Hypertension. So pathologically high blood pressure, that's a risk factor. Fourth is COPD. COPD is a risk factor, so chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and let me draw some attention to this. Smoking actually causes atherosclerosis to get worse, and it causes hypertension to get worse, and smoking is the major cause of COPD. So you can see that just by eliminating smoking, you're reducing the risk of developing an aneurysm in a huge way. Another risk factor is being male, simply by being male. And the reasons are not entirely known, but males are almost 5 times more likely to get aneurysms in female, which is just great. And age is a risk factor. If you're over 65 years old or 65 years young, then you are at risk of developing an aneurysm. And that's because older people tend to have stiffer aortas. So that's partly because of the calcifications, so the depositions of the calcium within the walls of the aorta that we talked about earlier. And partly because there's just been more degenerations of that collagen and elastin over time. Genetics is also a risk factor. So when they say genetics, I'm referring to a family history of positive. Family history, so first degree relative is more likely to develop an aneurysm than you are at an increased risk of developing an aneurysm. And also other genetic reasons. So if you have a genetic conditions that causes malformations of your collagen and elastin, will predispose you on the developing of an aneurysm. How do you know if you have an aneurysm or AAA? Or if you do have one, chances are you won't know about it because most people with AAAs are asymptomatic. Most AAAs are either discovered incidentally with an abdominal x-rays, during a routine physical exam, sometimes or unfortunately because of a rupture. But let's try to group our potential symptoms into 2 main groups. Symptoms that you might get with an intact aneurysms, so an aneurysm that hasn't ruptured. And symptoms that you might get with a ruptured aneurysm. So the main thing with AAAs can cause severe constant pain in your abdominal region. So you can get pain in your abdomen and your lower back or even your sides of your region. But some people actually describe feeling of a pulse in their abdominal as well. But some people actually describe feeling a pulse in their abdomen as well. They might actually feel a pulsatile sort of expansive mass in their abdomen, whereas the symptoms of a ruptured aneurysms are a little bit worse. So if you have a ruptured AAA, you need to be taken to a hospital right away. If sometimes as ruptured AAA, besides usually experiencing a lot of pain in the abdomen, they might develop hypertension. And that's because blood is leaking out of the circulatory system, so blood pressure can be maintained. They might develop tachycardia or markedly increased heart rate. And this would happen because the heart senses that the blood pressure has gone down, so it's trying to work harder and faster to move blood around the body. Syncope, otherwise known as fainting. That might happen because not being able to maintain blood pressure means that blood pressure may not be able to get up to the brain. It would cause faint. They also don't expose the patient to any radiation, but they take a bit longer to do. They're less readily available and they cost more than CT scans to do so.